Okay, hold on. We're getting started now, and let me suggest that we use this time that we're transitioning now into the morning. Let's use this time as we're transitioning, because you've set at tables now and we are talking. You can't hear this. Can I be heard back there now? Is this all right? Is this better? All right. Let's just take our momentum in talking, but let's be a little more constructive. In other words, would you go around the tables and just introduce yourself? Make sure everybody knows everybody. What district, what was the legacy district? What are you doing now? What's your center of focus in terms of interest? But make this very brief. Maybe just name where you are and what's your focus of interest and concern these days, and just to get everybody talking, all right? So you get only 3 minutes on this. But this is one at a time.
Come here. I got HDMI. HDMI is supposed to be an audio intake. Why am I not getting audio now? Watch out.
Okay, there should only be 23 people speaking in the whole room at this point. One at a time.
Yeah, I'm getting the pictures. I'm getting no audio.
Okay, let's stop now. Everybody finished? Well, hurry up. Is everybody done? All right, can I have your attention? This is going to be a more unruly crowd than I was expected. There should only be 23 people speaking in the whole room. Can I be heard back there? All right. All right, can I... I think one of the biggest problems we're having these days, I mean, I'm kind of presumptuous in saying this, but one of the biggest problems we're having is what I think we can call the mystification of holiness. And I think it's derived partly from the symbolism and the vision that was presented to us in the first reading. that is the tent that symbolizes God's presence, God's activity, God's love, God's protection, God's providence, is outside the camp. Well, God's presence isn't outside the camp anymore. God's presence is, and I think it's within us and in our communion. And that is what the Pope is trying to say when he's talking about the church as a field hospital. And it's a beautiful image of transitioning from outside the tent into the trenches. And our spirituality is trench-filled. We are in the ditches, not only like the Samaritan, but the ditches of our ordinary life. And that's not a mystery. That is where we have to find the presence of God. And I'd like to suggest that what we're about to do is try to make that practical in a process. And that process is what I am asked to introduce today, this morning, and that is what we're going to be calling this reflective writing process, which is also a way of reflecting even before we do the writing. And that way of reflecting is a way that allows us not to so much critique what is being said, which I know you're all doing right now as I'm speaking, but rather try to be in touch with what is the truth of what is being said, especially when that truth does not resonate with you as you hear it at the present moment. In other words, to be with the speakers on their terms, to be with the truth that is being offered on its terms and not on our terms of constantly using our filters and constantly using our own biases. So it's an attitude as well as a writing practice. It's a whole attitude of engaging these days together. It's an attitude of being reflective and not prioritizing what we usually get paid for, namely pulling out the truth and comparing it with some other truth and then saying, well, this is not the whole truth. Of course it's not the whole truth. Nothing's the whole truth. The whole truth is what we arrive at, or what takes possession of us when we manage to hold the ambiguities of the little truths that we have and that we are being presented with by other people. Let me talk about this process. First of all, also mentioning, as Matthew Fox once said, that it's blessed are the feet of those who bring the good news, not the footnotes. This presentation and all of these discussions and so forth are going to be based on that principle, not the footnotes, but the feet, that is our actual involvement in our own life, our own past, and our own present. So this is a time of grace, but it's also more fundamentally the present moment of grace, which is a moment that continues every present moment of our life. And this is not special time, except inasmuch as it is the time of the present moment. In other words, God is not outside the tent. God is within this process, within our own willingness to be honest and truthful about our life and share that with others in their truth and come to a deeper, richer, fuller truth. And we do that by looking at the past, where we've been in our life, the present moment, to the extent that the past is included in that moment, in our very aging, in our very bones, in our very feelings, in our very present anxieties and conflicts. The past is within us at this present moment, and the future is within us at the present moment in our desires and in our deepest longings. It's that kind of thinking that we are going to be engaged with in this process. Let me context what we're going to be doing in 4 different ways of looking at it from a Lasallian point of view. First of all, this is a Lasallian way of prayer. When St. LaSalle talks in his meditations on time of retreat, it's remarkable how much he doesn't talk about theory. That is to say, abstract theory, especially mystification theory of the virtues or of the scriptures, and it's a very concrete kind of approach to our life. In fact, what's remarkable is the number of times that St. LaSalle talks about how reflecting during the time of retreat on what we have been doing in the classrooms or in our own ministry. He talks about especially like the disciplining of the children. We should think about that. We should reflect on it, because the retreat opportunity gives us a time and a space to be our best self and to think about what was really happening. Were we disciplining the students, the founder says, on their terms, or were we disciplining the students on our terms? And that's a profound question, because it doesn't only apply to students, it applies to all of our life. How do we engage with our experiences as they unfold? Do we engage with them on their terms, the experience, the other people, our health, the terms in which we find ourselves, or are we engaging with life on our terms? Who's in charge here, so to speak? Are we willing to negotiate? Are we willing to interact with people in a way that allows their truth to come into contact with our truth? So for St. LaSalle, he didn't think of prayer just as meditating on the scriptures, and he certainly didn't think of prayer as just formal prayer. He thought of prayer as praying through our own life, and he manifests that in the very way he structures those meditations for time of retreat. That allows us, brothers, to see that our life is a gift. It's a gift that God has given us. It's not, our life is not the burden that we are to bear as formal presentations on holiness used to imply. Jesus came that we would have life and have it to the full. And we get that life by accepting, we get that attitude by accepting our life as it is unfolding at the moment in gratitude and not in opposition, not trying to always nuance something or be different or wish we were some other place. We're right here and now in our life situation, and it's in the spirit of gratitude that opens us to receive that grace. The founder, in his meditation, the notion of meditating on our own life then invites us to open the gift of our life and to look at it, and not be thinking so much of God as thinking of ourselves in the hands of God. We can't be thinking of God when we're in our ministry or when we're busy doing something else. We think of how we are responding to God's presence in the situation in which we're finding ourselves. And God's presence is not an abstraction. It's how we are relating to the other members of the mystical body, or thinking about it more concretely, how we are responding to other people and the situations in ourselves as we experience what is really happening at this moment. The second concept of this process in Lassallean terms has to do with the spirit of faith. St. Lassalle is very interesting, very significantly does not talk very much, at least, about faith. He talks about a spirit of faith. In other words, he doesn't seem to be, although he's certainly interested in, but he doesn't seem to be as important, it doesn't seem to him to be as important not only that we have allegiance to dogmas and doctrines, but that we have a vision. The spirit of faith is a way of seeing. It's a way of seeing the way God sees, the founder says. It's a way of seeing our life, or later, as he says, putting on the mind of Christ, seeing as Christ saw, or as Christ sees at the present moment, as Jesus saw. How did he see his life, and how did he see his interaction with other people? What did he see his contribution was to be? And that is really the challenge we have for our contribution. He saw his contribution to be healing and forgiving, and what St. Paul will finally define as love, patience and kindness, and seeking the truth, and not just manipulating the situation in whatever way we can. So the spirit of faith is first a vision. It's a way of seeing the way God sees. But it's also a way, the spirit of faith has to do with fidelity. It's a practice. It's just not an intellectual or just not a visionary thing. It's also a practice. And that practice is the way St. Lassalle talks about it in terms of the will of God. Our will being in conformity with God's will. What does it look like for our will to be in conformity to God's will? Well, the first thing we know about God's will is that God is not coercive. That's the first thing, and that's the fundamental thing. God allows freedom. Jesus came that we would be free. St. Paul says, don't go back to your sin, it's going back to bondage. Because now we are no longer free from the dynamics within ourselves that are compelling ourselves to not be open and loving in the situation in which we find ourselves. And that use of the will we call willingness. The opposite of that is willfulness. Willfulness is not important or not even appropriate in our spiritual journey, but willfulness is all that we see acclaimed in the culture. If you're not willful, you're a wimp. No, that's not the case. You can be willing. That is, you can be open to possibilities that a willful bullying person, a willful person who goes into temper tantrums, would never even experience. So it's the willingness, it's the use of the will in the willingness to do God's will and the willingness to receive God's providential love. And sometimes, of course, that love looks to us from our point of view as good news, and sometimes it looks like bad news. So from God's point of view, it's all love. From our point of view, it's good news or bad news. When we are doing this process, we are going to come into our experience sometimes feeling good, and sometimes saying, oh yeah, the speaker's saying just what I want him to say, therefore I'm going to tell this person beside me who doesn't agree with me what is really the truth. That is not the direction of where we want to go here. We want to go with the direction of willingness. Willingness to receive the good news, but also willingness to receive the bad news. The bad news that maybe we haven't had such a vision of faith. Maybe we have filtered our experience with certain biases. Maybe we do have blind spots that we haven't seen. And maybe this person across the table, this person we meet walking down to lunch, is saying something that nibbles at the toes or the heels of our blind spots. And we really need to take that into consideration. The third way that we can see this in terms of LaSalle is the fact that we continue to participate in the story of salvation history. In other words, the salvation history did not end, and Revelation did not end with the death of the last apostle or at some remote time in the past. Revelation continues. It continues in the Spirit's working through the mystical body, through the members of the mystical body. And we participate in that continuous salvation history. God comes to us, comes to birth in us as our life. And God loves us into existence. God continues to love us in our present existence. And God loves us into the future, as he was loving the chosen people who were responding to his love the best they could, but they had their filters and their biases, and they didn't quite get it. That's why we needed Jesus to be present. We needed a deeper, richer revelation of God's love, and Jesus gives it to us. We're not so much people of a book, we are people of a person. And that salvation history now continues into the present day, into the mystical body, and the way we respond to God's love in our life. It is true that what St. LaSalle says, it is God's work. That's true, but that's not the whole truth. It is also our work. It's God's work and our work. As Desmond Tutu once mentioned recently, God, without us, cannot bring about the kingdom, or God without us will not bring about the kingdom, and we without God cannot bring about the kingdom. It's a collaborative bringing about the kingdom, and that is what we're into. I mean, that's the point. It's not running a good school only, except in as much as the good school or our good ministry brings about the kingdom. So the continuation of the story of salvation is very important to see and to know. And the fourth way that this process can be seen from a Lassallean and spiritual point of view is the idea of self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is not only, in the spiritual tradition, psychological self-knowledge, although that's an important ingredient. or could be an important ingredient if it's the right kind of psychological self-knowledge. But the self-knowledge that the spiritual tradition talks about is a different kind of self-knowledge. And it's indicated by, especially by Teresa of Avila, Thomas Merton, and of course our friend Therese of Lisieux. The Teresa of Avila speaks of self-knowledge as the fundamental beginning and continuous ingredient in any kind of prayer. She says the first room of that interior castle is self-knowledge. And she says nobody ever advances in prayer far enough that they don't need to come back often and always to the food of self-knowledge. And that self-knowledge is, as Thomas Merton finally says, the self-knowledge of knowing ourselves as we are in the hands of God. And again, that's not an abstraction. It's knowing ourselves as we are facilitating within ourselves and through ourselves to other people, how we are facilitating love. Are we patient and kind? Or are we jealous and rude and excessively prone to anger and harboring, delighting in evil? Or all those things that St. Paul says love is not. And it's very easy to check that out because it's all intuitive. We know when we're not patient and kind. We know when we're not at our best. Thomas Merton talks about this self-knowledge as coming into contact with our true self. That's not some mysterious thing. We all know when we're at our best. We all know when we are not trying to be other than or to impress people or to contend with people or to change people violently or coercively, or even changing ourselves coercively or violently in order to become perfect. We all know that. That's a very intuitive thing. And that's what this self-knowledge is all about. It's about what Therese and Teresa of Avila and Merton did often, and for Merton it was a compulsion practically, that is to journal, that is to write. Put this reflection that comes to us at our best moments, put it down on paper, because we're not going to believe it in a week. We won't even recognize some of the things we write today or these days. We won't recognize them a week from now or 2 weeks from now, because we'll be in a different place. And then when we do reread what we've written today, what we've written these days about our own life, not only taking notes on the speakers, but what we've written about our own life, when we reread that, we can ask ourselves, and this gives the process an extension, we can ask ourselves, what kind of a person would write this stuff? What kind of a person is really behind this? That gives us a sense of where we're coming from and helps us to see things out of the corner of our eye that we don't see and that constitutes our blind spots. That's the context. Let's do the practice. Go to the section in your journal that, or in the book, that is the note section and the journaling section at the back of the book. And let's take the first question that we want to write about. Now again, this is private, this is personal, this is not going to be shared. The writing is not to be shared. I mean, you could share the content after you've disguised it to protect the innocent. You can discuss it, but we're not going to read what we've written. in these questions. It's private, it's personal. But the good news is we already did it. We already started it intuitively last evening when you identified a brother who was important for you. You are already into the process of reflecting on our life in a non-critical, non-condemnatory, non-filtered way. In other words, trying to come to the truth of who we really are. So the first question is simple enough, and that is, what, you don't need to write the question, just think about it for a moment and then do the writing. You wrote the name of a brother who you identified last evening as being a significant and supportive brother to you and manifested even God's presence. The question I have, think about it and then write it down as extensively as you want. Not too extensively, we don't have a lot of time. But these are open-ended questions and you can always come back and fill them in later. What was going on in your life at a time when that brother whom you identified as helpful actually helped you? What was going on in your life when that brother was actually helpful for you? And that could be good news or bad news. But just make a note of it, briefly. What was going on in your life that made it important for you to be in the presence of that brother? All right. You got it. Close the book. Maybe just share one at a time now again. Listen to one another. This is listening to our experiences as a community. Listen to one another. Make this brief. We have only a few minutes. It can be as brief as possible. There's no contention here. There's no discussion. Just listen to one another. What was happening in your life that in which you needed the help of that brother? All right? One at a time. Let's do it. Everybody doesn't have to share if you'd prefer not to. Okay, we just have another minute. Okay, brothers. One more minute. Okay.
Brothers, if you would try to finish your table conversation. Thank you. As you can see by your schedule, the second part of our morning program is Brother Miguel. I am not Brother Miguel, but we are very grateful to Brother Miguel. Is Brother Miguel in the room? Is Miguel in the room? Maybe in absentia we could give a round of applause to Miguel to show our appreciation for his presentation that we're about to hear. We have invited 4 brothers who will share the talk that Brother Miguel has prepared. So I invite our 4 brothers, if you would come forward now.
And this is from Brother Miguel, and he writes, one general observation. The brothers who faced a critical historical moment in 1712 to 1714 belonged to different generational groups embedded in different cultural stories. They brought different perspectives into the conversation. Likewise, in our own time in 2016, those who have joined the community between 1946 and today were entering a cultural story that was radically changing with the distinctive generational groups emerging. We need to understand first how these generations interacted with one another before turning our attention towards the generations today. The brothers who lived together in this historic moment of 1712 to 1714 had entered into the conversation from very diverse perspectives and at different times.
Miguel continues as he presents these 3 generations, then and now. So the first generation, then. The first generation was 1682 to 1694. Must have been impacted by the passionate conversion of the young Canon de La Salle, barely 30 years old. After the departure of the very first teachers, with little preparation and spiritual motivation, more adept young men arrived, deeply motivated for the education of the poor. A great affinity among them and the young canon existed. They set out to live the gospel in a most radical manner, making present the compassion of God. Some of them exhibited a predisposition and talents for the service of education. No formal initial novitiate. As soon as they entered, they were sent to teach. They were formed in the trenches. A minimum of structures were set up with a view of assuring continuity and the permanency of the mission. Ultimately, the glue that bound them together was the charism for mission, passion for God, and passion for the poor. Some of the brothers in this generational group became intimate friends and accomplished associates. For example, Nicholas Fouillard and Gabriel Drouin.
The second generation then. The second generation, 1694 to 1705, had a novitiate conducted by De La Salle. Their continuing formation in community and ministry was nourished in daily exercises through letter writing to the superior, not to mention community meetings, assemblies, and yearly retreats. In this segment of the foundational journey, De La Salle and the brothers paid attention to structuring their life together and their ministry. The structuring of the charism was an open-ended process in which all were included. De La Salle became an authority in the field of education. His books were written with the brothers, for them, and for their students. The voices of lay teachers were heard under the leadership of De La Salle. Together, they set out the structures that assured the permanency of the mission. Slowly, a gospel-centered spirituality was emerging in the context of a secular commitment in view of transforming society. With this second generation, De La Salle experienced a different way of being church, a more ministerial, communal church of equals at the periphery of society, becoming the church of the poor by embracing those who felt rejected without promise or covenants. Now they were perceived as children of the Father, fully members of God's household. This generation of brothers was different from the first generation in that they were used to mediating life happenings and events through structures that they themselves created with their superior. However, structures did not negate the charism. Far from being a repression or tool for management control, structures were a support for the charismatic brother. In this generational group were active co-founders with De La Salle. Brothers like Bartolome, Timothy, and Ponce were very talented for administration. They experienced firsthand the need for unity in the Association for Mission. They understood the weaknesses of their legal status. They knew what they had to do. They were aware of the interference of clerics. They assumed the consequences.
The third generation, then. The third generation, 1705 to 1719, should not be undervalued. Truly, they had little to contribute to the structuring that took up much energy and time with the second generation. De La Salle is revising all his publications for the Christian schools and for the spiritual and professional formation of the brothers. Daily, weekly, and yearly school and community activities at this point of our history were consolidated. After the chapter of 1718, the new superior began to seek a canonical status for the congregation. This action, which the founder had never pursued, had put an end to the tensions with the corporations of teachers. This third generation would be able to live and work relatively in peace.
So the three generations then our understanding should not be too geometrical. The first one would be understood as prophetic and charismatic. The second one would put in place the structures that could harness any uncritical impetuosity. And the third one would be accused of institutionalizing the movement of the Spirit and in absolute fidelity to the original charism and fidelity to the world today in freedom, creativity, and audacity. Without structures and institutions, it would be very difficult to assure the permanency of the mission. Without the charism and prophecy, structures and institutions may become irrelevant. The introduction to the Now and our Dina summer retreat here in Philadelphia. It is relatively safe to talk about generational groups in the process of foundation of the Institute. The process was completed 300 years ago. There is no one alive to contradict and to challenge the interpretation. Emotionally more detached from a process that is by far removed from our experience, we are able to analyze more critically the documents that support this interpretation. The proposal of an interpretation of the current generational groups is more complex and should be understood as an invitation to reflect together on who we are and where we have been. The conversation must remain open. Keeping in mind this warning, we can identify 3 generations developing in the Northeast U.S. since 1946. The General Chapter and Superior General that attempted to stop history. They wanted to freeze any changes.
The first generation now. The brothers belonging to this first generation are mostly retired. Some are struggling with health issues. They are a group who are rapidly disappearing. They were, for the most part, initiated in religious life in juniораtes and followed formation programs that survived until 1966. Those who were exposed to that systematic and rigid approach were initiated in religious life, emphasizing a spirituality that was more relative to the 19th century than to the New World. However, many had the wisdom or the common sense to understand that many rituals of community and aspects of their work were obsolete, and silently they were creating new approaches. These are the brothers who responded to the needs of an immigrant church and on whose shoulders we have been able to build a very strong, optimistic Dina district. They attracted many young men searching for community and a career in education. All subsequent generations are indebted to this group of hard-working men that in the light of a deeply sacrificial spirituality, they often had to give up personal self-interest for the common good or the benefit of the institutions. In spite of limitations and ambiguities, they have remained faithful to the dream, persevering until the end. It is very hard for them to leave their institutions. They hope to relive the past with new brothers. Of course, this first generation of brothers were used to schools run by brothers only. However, now, these brothers accept our lay partners and they recognize the passion of our volunteers for our charism and the energy of new initiatives in the service of the poor in association with the laity. Still, for some of these brothers, their top priority is to repeat what we once were.
The second generation now. The second generation has an entirely different story. By the end of Vatican II and through the 70s, anybody entering an initial program would find some of the features of this scenario. Formation personnel themselves in the midst of personal crisis. The curriculum often in flux and in the hands of experts. Rather than discernment of an authentic vocation, the main concern was the growth of the person. Spiritual directors became counselors who accompany the process of becoming self-reliant with a strong identity to decide for himself. There are strong personalities in this generational group, to say the least. Because of the dramatic turn of events in the Institute, departures of many brothers, diminishing numbers of vocations in some parts of the world, these second-generation brothers had to assume very soon and very young important administrative jobs. Some have excelled in their own fields and disciplines. They have become professionals who have contributed to the professionalization of many institutions. Their formation was in smaller groups compared to the first generation. Often it was not very systematic. They had to find their identity on their own. Obedience to a community project seems to be less important than to have personal freedom to self-actualization. However, they were very generous and engaging in their ministries, often serving as administrators. But they have welcomed Lasallians to be formed and to assume positions previously reserved for brothers.
The third generation now. The third generation, who are few, but who we hope will become more, are formed in even smaller groups, and they seek connections with young brothers in the region and in the International Institute. They seem to get an impetus in our vocation by connections with this wider group of young brothers. For some, they are interested in some characteristics of the first generation.
The three generations now. Brothers, we consider these three generations because all of us in this room are part of at least one of them. Sometimes we belong to two generations. For instance, as Brother Miguel writes, chronologically, I am of the first generation, but definitely formed in traditional ways, but mentally, I am part of the second generation. We also have different cultural histories that are part of who we are. What we need to do is to give voice to our own ideas while listening to others and respecting each other. It is pretty simple. Let us get to appreciate all our brothers of the three generations and respect them. We are maturing in a changing brotherhood, a deeply spiritual and sometimes painful experience. Intuitively, we realize that as time goes on, we are refounding the Institute. Young Lasallian men and women stand ready to join our community and mission. May we make that part of our time together this week. Thank you for listening to these ideas. As you go to your group discussions, please consider this question. How does this presentation resonate with your own experience?
So again, another round of applause for Brother Miguel and his representatives. Brothers, we will come to the question for you to consider, but we will not do that right now. We will take a half-hour break, and when the break is over, if you come back to your tables, and we will have the discussion of the question that Frank just read to you, and that will be on the screen when you come back. So we'll meet again at 11:15 by our official clock. Live Jesus in our hearts.